There's a rule in this town, one that's been whispered from parent to child for generations. You don't answer the knock, you don't look out the window, and whatever you do, you never open the door. Not at night, not ever. No one knows how long it's been happening. Some say it started with the old houses, those that sit far out in the woods, where the trees press in like watching eyes. Others say it's been here longer than any of us, lurking in the darkness before the first road was ever built. Most folks follow the rule. They pretend not to hear it. They bury themselves under blankets, close their eyes, and pray for morning. And most of the time, the knocking moves on. Most of the time, but not always. Because every few years, someone breaks the rule. And when they do, they're never seen again. That's how it started last winter. Right after the snowstorm, when the roads were buried deep, and the power lines snapped under the weight of the ice. The whole town was swallowed in silence except for one house. It belonged to a man named Ethan, and Ethan didn't know the rule. He wasn't from here, just passing through, looking for a place to clear his head. A photographer, maybe, or a writer. Someone who thought a week alone in the mountains would do him good. He didn't listen when the shopkeeper at the gas station told him, "Storm's coming. Best get where you're going and stay inside." He only laughed and said, "That's the plan." That was the last time anyone saw him. Another knock, but we heard him. We all heard him, and we heard the knocking too. Then a new voice panicked, breathless, whispering,
"I don't have much time. If you're watching this, don't look outside. Don't listen. And whatever you do, don't answer the knock."
The road to the cabin was long, winding, and empty. No streetlights, no houses, just miles of thick trees pressing in on either side. Ethan gripped the wheel a little tighter as he made the last turn onto the dirt path. His headlights barely cut through the mist creeping in between the trees. His GPS had already lost signal 10 minutes ago, but he wasn't worried. He had the directions written down. The rental listing had described the cabin as a peaceful retreat in nature. A place to disconnect, to escape. Exactly what he needed. A break from the noise, from the city, from everything. When he finally pulled up, the cabin stood dark against the backdrop of the woods. A small, one-story structure with a wraparound porch and an old rocking chair that swayed slightly in the wind. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the cold bit at his skin as he stepped out of the car. Ethan grabbed his bag, locked the car behind him, and made his way up the porch steps. The wooden planks creaked under his weight, the sound disappearing into the vast emptiness around him. He paused. Silence. Not a single bird. No insects. Just nothing. He shook off the uneasy feeling, pushing open the cabin door. The place was small but cozy, wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and old furniture that smelled faintly of dust. A single window looked out into the trees, their dark forms stretching high into the sky. After setting his things down, he walked through the cabin, flipping on the lights, checking the locks. Everything seemed fine. But that silence outside still felt unnatural. That first night, he didn't sleep well. Not because of the cabin, it was quiet, too quiet, and his thoughts wouldn't settle. Maybe it was the change of scenery, or maybe it was something else. At exactly 3:00 a.m., something woke him. A knock. Soft, rhythmic, not at the door, but at the window. Ethan lay still, blinking in the darkness. The knock came again. He sat up, heart pounding, and reached for his phone. The screen lit up. 3:00 a.m. The knock didn't come again. For a long moment, he just sat there, listening. The wind had stopped. The trees outside didn't move. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Finally, he slid out of bed, moving slowly toward the window. He expected to see an animal, maybe a tree branch tapping against the glass, but when he pulled the curtain aside, there was nothing, just darkness, the trees, the empty yard, a trick of the wind. Maybe. He shook his head, exhaling, and turned away. His phone buzzed. He frowned and glanced at the screen. Missed call, and no number. No voicemail, no message, just silence. His stomach twisted. Maybe it was a telemarketer. Maybe just a glitch. Then, another buzz. A text. He swiped to open it. Just 2 words. I see you. Ethan's breath hitched. His eyes flicked back toward the window. His reflection stared back at him. Pale and wide-eyed. But the yard outside remained empty. His pulse hammered against his ribs. It had to be a prank. Some bad joke from a friend who knew he was out here. That's what he told himself. But as he set his phone down and crawled back into bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching him. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was truly alone out here. The next morning, the sky was a dull gray, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Ethan stepped onto the porch, rubbing the back of his neck. His sleep had been restless, full of strange dreams he couldn't quite remember. But the woods outside were still and quiet, untouched by whatever had disturbed him in the night. He decided to go for a hike. Maybe fresh air would clear his head, push out the knees that had settled deep in his bones. He grabbed his camera and slung his backpack over his shoulder. The trail behind the cabin led deeper into the forest. The trees stood tall, their bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the sky. The farther he walked, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just silence. Ethan adjusted his backpack, ignoring the prickling sensation at the back of his neck. It was just his imagination. He was alone, or at least, he thought he was. He raised his camera, snapping photos as he went. The winding path, the old trees, the way the mist curled at his feet. He lifted the camera again, focusing on a clearing. Up ahead and froze. A figure stood among the trees. Tall, still, almost blending into the shadows. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He lowered the camera. The figure was gone. His pulse hammered. He blinked, scanning the trees. But there was nothing. Just empty woods stretching out in every direction. A trick of the light, he told himself. A weird shadow. His own nerves playing games with him. But the uneasy feeling never left. The air felt heavier, pressing against him. He turned to leave, suddenly eager to get back to the cabin. Then, out of nowhere, a heavy force slammed against his forehead. The world tilted. His vision blurred as he crashed onto the cold, damp ground. For a moment, he just lay there, stunned. Pain throbbed through his skull. His hands trembled as he touched his forehead. Warm, sticky blood. What the hell just happened? He forced himself to sit up, his head spinning. A thick branch lay beside him, freshly broken. Had it fallen? No. He felt the impact. It didn't drop from above. It hit him. But that didn't make sense. There was no one out here, right? His breathing was uneven as he pulled himself to his feet. He needed to leave. Now, he grabbed his backpack, ignored the pounding in his head, and started back toward the cabin. The trees loomed taller. The trail felt longer. The silence felt wrong. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had darkened. A storm was coming, thick clouds rolling in overhead. He locked the doors, checked the windows. The uneasy feeling still clung to him like a second skin, but he told himself it was nothing. Just a bad fall, just a stupid accident. By 3 a.m., Ethan was awake again, and this time, the knocking came harder. Slow, heavy, deliberate. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, willing himself to ignore it. Louder this time, more forceful. His fingers clenched the blankets. His heart pounded in his ears. He wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, moving slowly, carefully. He slid out of bed. The knocking didn't stop. It never hesitated. It just continued, steady and unshaken. He reached the door, pressed his ear against it. No voices, no footsteps. Just knocking. He swallowed hard. His hand hovered over the doorknob, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he moved to the peephole. He took a deep breath and looked. The knocking stopped. The porch was empty. No footprints in the snow, no shadow moving away, just nothing. His pulse thundered as he backed away from the door. He turned toward the window, needing to check again, and froze. His reflection was staring back at him, but something was wrong. His breath hitched. His reflection wasn't moving. Ethan lifted his hand. The reflection did not. His stomach twisted into knots. His mouth went dry. Then, slowly, The reflection's lips began to curl into a smile. A smile Ethan knew he wasn't making. And in the reflection behind him, the door handle started to turn. The smell of coffee and frying bacon should have been comforting. It should have reminded Ethan of home, of slow mornings, of something familiar. But here, in this small-town diner, everything felt off. The air was heavy, thick with whispers and stolen glances. Conversations hushed the moment he walked in. The old ceiling fan above him creaked as it turned, turning in slow, lazy circles, as if the whole place had stopped moving the moment he entered. He took a seat at the counter. The stool wobbled slightly under his weight. The waitress, mid-40s. Tired eyes poured him a cup of coffee without asking. "You from the cabin?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. He didn't like the way she said it. Like the cabin wasn't just a place. Like it was something more. "Yeah," he said, "just renting for a few weeks." She didn't respond. Just gave a small nod and walked away. Like that was all she needed to know. Ethan stared at his coffee, steam curling up into the dim light. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he knew he wouldn't get answers unless he asked. An old man sat at the corner of the diner, nursing a black coffee. Deep wrinkles cut across his face like cracks in old stone. His hands, rough and veined, twitched slightly as he held his cup. Ethan could feel the man watching him. So he turned, met his gaze. "You seen him yet?" the old man asked, voice like rust scraping metal. Evan's stomach dropped. "Seen who?" he asked, even though he already knew. The old man leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. His eyes were dark, too dark. "Once you see him," the man said. "He sees you." The words hung in the air, pressing against Ethan's chest. Ethan forced a laugh. "You mean the faceless man?" The old man didn't smile, didn't blink. "You laugh now," he said, "but you won't soon." Ethan swallowed. His mouth was dry. "What happens if you see him?" The old man sighed, rubbing his hands together, like the memory alone made his skin crawl. "You don't just see him," he said. "You feel him, in your dreams, in the silence, in the spaces where you swear no one is there. You start to notice things you can't explain. You hear knocks, but no one's at the door. You see footprints, but they don't lead anywhere. You wake up in places you don't remember falling asleep. He's always just a little closer than before." And one night, the old man stopped, eyes flicking toward the window. One night, he gets in. Ethan felt cold all over. The old man lifted his coffee and took a slow sip. "There was another man," he said. "Stayed at that cabin a while back, never came back. His car was still parked outside, bags unpacked, house still locked from the inside. Just gone." Ethan felt something press against his ribs, a sharp kind of fear. "What happened to him?" he asked. The old man shook his head. "Ain't for me to say." Ethan wanted to push for more, but the waitress reappeared, dropping the check in front of him. "Best head back before dark," she said quietly. Ethan didn't argue, but as he stood up, something caught his eye, a photograph on the diner wall. A group of people, some in black and white, some faded, yellowed with age, the heading read "Missing." His eyes scanned the faces, one by one. And then his breath caught. His stomach twisted so violently, he thought he might throw up. Because one of the faces, one of the people missing for 50 years, looked exactly like him. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He couldn't. He locked the doors, checked them twice, 3 times. His skin crawled at the thought of what the old man had said. "Once you see him, he sees you." At some point, exhaustion took over. His eyes closed. His breathing slowed. Sleep took him, and then the dream came. He was standing in the middle of the woods. The trees stretched high above him, their branches curving inward like a cage. And there, in the darkness, was the faceless man, not moving, not breathing. Just standing. The fear wasn't like anything Ethan had ever felt. It wasn't panic. It wasn't terror. It was deeper, older, the kind of fear that sat in the bones, that lingered in the blood. Then, the faceless man moved, not forward, not backward, but suddenly, he was closer. Ethan tried to run. His feet wouldn't move. The air was thick, heavy, like the whole world had slowed down. And then, in the silence, came the knocking. Louder. Closer. It was coming from behind him. Ethan turned and woke up. His body was soaked in sweat. His hands were shaking, his breathing ragged. He tried to tell himself it was just a dream, just stress. But then, he saw the footprints, muddy, wet, leading from the front door to his bed. He scrambled up, heart hammering. He ran to the door, yanked it open, still locked. But the footprints were there, right in front of him, leading from the inside. You might be thinking, why doesn't he just leave? Why doesn't he grab his keys, throw his bags in the car, and drive as far away from this place as possible? Well, Ethan has thought of that more than once, but life had never made things easy for him. He came here because he had nowhere else to go. No family, no friends, a job that had been slipping through his fingers for months, no one waiting for him anywhere. The silence was unbearable. Ethan had never been the kind of guy to get scared easily. But something about the emptiness of the cabin, the way they were pressed in around him at night, the way shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, made him feel like he was losing his mind. He needed company, not a person, no. He didn't want to explain why he wasn't sleeping, why he kept waking up drenched in sweat, why his reflection in the window didn't always move when he did. But a dog would help, something alive, something breathing, something that would bark if there was actually something there. So the next afternoon, he drove into town, following a hand-drawn sign that read "Free Puppies" pinned to a wooden post near the diner. The owner, an old man with tired eyes, didn't ask questions. He only led Ethan to the back of his house, where a few dogs, some full-grown, some barely past puppies, wagged their tails behind a rusted wire fence. One dog caught Ethan's eye, a big, shaggy German Shepherd, bigger than most, with thick fur and sharp, intelligent eyes. The moment their eyes met, the dog stilled, its ears flicking up, staring at Ethan like it already knew him, or worse, like it was waiting for him. "You want that one?" the old man asked. Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, what's his name?" The old man scratched his beard, as if he didn't remember. "He don't got one." Ethan nodded. "All right, I'll take him," as Ethan reached out to clip the leash on. The dog flinched just for a second before stepping forward. Its body was tense, eyes locked on something over Ethan's shoulder. He turned. Nothing there. Just the open woods. He shook it off and led the dog to his truck. When he got back to the cabin, the dog hesitated before stepping inside. Ethan didn't think much of it. He was just getting used to the place, probably. New surroundings, new smells, that's all. But the moment Ethan walked into his bedroom, his stomach dropped. The bed was made. The pillows were fluffed. His blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed. He stood there, his mind refusing to make sense of it. He hadn't done this. He was sure he hadn't. His skin prickled. The dog let out a low, warning growl. Something was wrong. Someone or something had been in his room. And then, just like that, the feeling passed. The dog stopped growling. Ethan forced a breath out. Maybe he had done it and just forgot. Maybe this place was making him paranoid. He was tired. That was all. So he shook his head, patted the dog's side, and said, "Guess it's just you and me now, buddy." The dog didn't wag its tail, didn't even blink. It just watched him. That night, Ethan slept lighter than ever. Every creak in the cabin made his nerves fire. Every gust of wind against the window sounded too much like a whisper. And then, at 3 a.m., the knocking returned, and his heart stopped. The dog's ears shot up. Ethan clenched the blankets, holding his breath. The knocking came again, louder this time. And then, before Ethan could react, the dog shot up, sprinting toward the door like something was inside. Ethan barely had time to sit up before the dog snarled, snapping its teeth, barking so hard it shook the walls. Ethan had never heard a sound like that. It wasn't normal barking, it was panicked, wild, terrified. Then, just as suddenly the barking stopped, they returned ice cold. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The dog was still by the door, staring at it, ears pinned back. Then the dog's body jerked forward, its paws slamming against the wooden floor. Ethan jumped out of bed. The dog let out a sharp, pained yelp, then went dead silent. The room filled with a thick, suffocating stillness. Ethan's hands were shaking as he rushed toward the dog. It was laying on its side, motionless. Its chest rose and fell shallow, barely breathing. But its eyes were open, wide, and moving, and its mouth wouldn't open. Its teeth were clamped together, tighter than any natural bite. Not growling, not whimpering, just silent. Ethan dropped to his knees, shaking the dog's fur. Hey, hey, wake up, boy, come on, wake up. Nothing. The dog stared at him, and blinking, like something inside had switched off. And then Ethan saw it, a few tufts of fur scattered near the door. Like the dog had been in a fight, or like something had grabbed him. Ethan's stomach turned. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something he could explain. He backed away from the dog, his skin crawling, and then, slowly the dog turned its head toward him, but its body didn't move. It was unnatural. Wrong. And Ethan realized something else. The dog wasn't blinking. Not once. Not at all. Just staring. As if it was waiting. The next morning, Ethan woke up with the sick feeling still lodged in his chest. He turned over. The dog was gone. No prints. No sign that he had ever been there. Ethan ran outside, calling his name. Nothing. He searched the woods, checked behind the cabin. Nowhere. The leash was still inside. His food and water were untouched. It was like he had simply vanished. Ethan didn't know what to think. Was the dog scared and ran? Did something take him? Or was he ever even real at all? His head spun, his hands clenched into fists. First, the noises, then the dreams, then the knocking. And now, this. Ethan felt something deep in his gut, a sinking, horrifying realization. He wasn't meant to leave this place. And now, neither was the dog. The silence that followed was worse than anything, because now, he was alone again. And the knocking, it was coming back. Ethan had never felt more alone. He sat in the dim glow of his laptop, hands trembling as he adjusted the camera feeds. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, a steady and comfortable rhythm that matched the tension in his chest. He had set up cameras all over the cabin, one by the front door, another in the hallway, a third one in the bedroom. If something was knocking every night, if something had been inside his house, inside his room, he needed to see it. He wasn't just scared anymore. He was angry. Something had taken his dog. Something had messed with his head. He needed proof. The cameras blinked to life, showing different angles of the cabin. The front porch was empty, just the old rocking chair shifting slightly in the wind. The hallway was still, stretching into shadows. The bedroom camera reflected him, sitting on the bed, staring at his own tired face on the screen. The waiting was the worst part. The hours crawled by. His eyelids grew heavy, but he refused to let sleep take him. Outside, the trees stood frozen to still. The wind didn't move the branches. There were no animal sounds, no insects. Just an unnatural, suffocating silence. He checked the time on the laptop. To 59 a.m. His breath caught in his throat. Any second now. 3 o'clock a.m. Then every screen went black. Ethan's body tensed. His fingers dug into the sheets. Static hissed in his ears. 13 seconds. No sound, no movement, just complete, endless, hollow darkness. Then just as suddenly the cameras came back. His stomach twisted violently. His hands felt numb as he stared at the screen. He was watching himself sleep. The bedroom cameras showed him lying on the bed, blankets twisted, body motionless. His breathing was slow, steady, but he wasn't alone. Something was standing over him, a figure. Tall and moving, featureless. The screen flickered. Ethan's breath shattered in his chest. The figure was still, but its head was turning, slowly, so painfully, slow. Turning toward the camera. And that's when he saw it. It had no face. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty flesh where a face should be. The screen glitched. The figure lurched forward. Ethan slammed the laptop shut. His hands were shaking. His whole body felt like ice. His breath came in uneven gasps as he pressed his palms against his forehead. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But he had seen it. And worse, it had seen him. Ethan barely slept after that. When his eyes finally shut, exhaustion dragging him down, his mind didn't let him rest. Darkness swirled behind his eyelids. Sounds echoed in the distance, whispers, footsteps crunching over leaves. The soft creak of his bedroom door opening. He woke up with a jolt. The room was pitch black. His mouth was dry. His skin felt clammy with sweat. He sucked in a sharp breath. But something was wrong. His hands hurt. A dull, aching sting throbbed at his fingertips. He slowly lifted his hands into the glow of the bedside lamp. His fingers were caked with dirt beneath. His nails black soil, packed deep, like he had been digging. His stomach twisted in horror. No, he hadn't left the bed. He would have remembered. He would have. His gaze fell to his arms. There were scratches, thin, red lines running up his skin, as if he had clawed at something in his sleep. Or, as if something had grabbed him. His breath came in short, and even gasps. He forced himself out of bed, stumbling toward the door. His legs felt weak, like he had been walking for hours. His mind raced. Had he gone outside? Had he? No. The door was still locked, but as he stood there, staring at his own trembling hands, a thought crept into his mind, so sharp and cold it nearly made him sick. What if it wasn't me digging? What if something made me, and worse? What was I digging for? Ethan could feel his sanity slipping. His hands were still stained with dirt. His arms still burned from the scratches. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them made sense. Something was happening to him. Something was changing him, and he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to leave. Now. He grabbed his keys, barely remembering the movement. His hands were shaking as he shoved his boots on, threw open the front door, and stepped into the cold night air. The woods stretched out before him, silent and waiting. The sky was dark, moonless. Even the stars seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the endless black. He didn't care. He ran to his car, fumbling with the door handle before forcing it open. His heart was hammering so hard it hurt. He had to get out of here. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. For the first time in days, he felt hope. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he sped down the narrow road, his headlights cutting through the fog. Trees blurred past him in streaks of darkness. He didn't look back, didn't think. Just drove. Faster. The road twisted through the forest, a winding path that should have led him back to town. But after 10 minutes, something felt wrong. His hands tightened around the wheel. His stomach twisted. He saw something ahead. His cabin. No, that wasn't possible. He slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't back. He shouldn't be back. He had been driving straight. He had been leaving. And yet the cabin stood right in front of him, exactly as he had left it. The porch light flickered, humming softly. His bedroom window was dark. The front door was closed, like he had never left, like it had been waiting for him. A cold chill crawled up his spine. He clenched the wheel, trying to steady his breathing. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he had taken a wrong turn. He would try again. He put the car in reverse, backing up onto another road, took a deep breath, and drove. This time, he turned at every chance he got, left, then right, then left again. He didn't care where the road led so long as it wasn't back there. But after another 10 minutes the cabin was in front of him, exactly the same. As if he had never moved. A low static filled the car. Ethan barely noticed at first, to focused on the impossible road ahead. Then the radio clicked on by itself. The screen was dark, blank, but the speakers crackled. At first, it was just breathing. Slow, and even. Then a voice, his own voice. He's already inside. Ethan's blood froze. The voice was his, but it was in single quotas. It was wrong, distorted, hollow, like something was wearing his voice like a mask. His hands locked on the wheel. His mind screamed at him to keep going, but he knew. He already knew. If the voice was telling the truth, if it was already inside, he wasn't escaping. Not like this. Not in the car. Not on the road. Because the road wasn't real. It was a trap. It had always been a trap. His stomach twisted violently. He turned the wheel, sped back toward the cabin. He didn't want to go back. He needed to. Because if something was inside, if something was in his house, he needed to see it. His tires screeched as he pulled up the drive. The headlights illuminated the porch and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The front door was open. Not just unlocked, wide open, like someone had been waiting for him to come back. The house was dark beyond the doorway, a black hole of shadows. His legs felt weak as he stepped out of the car. The night air was still heavy. The cabin stared back at him, daring him to come inside. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he stepped in. He swallowed hard, forcing his breathing to stay even. The air smelled wrong. Not like dust, not like old wood. Like something rotten. His fingers brushed against the light switch. He flicked it on. The bulbs buzzed, struggling, before flickering to life. And then he saw it. A photo album sat open on the table. Ethan's stomach twisted. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked toward it. The pages were old, yellowed with time. The pictures were black and white at first, images of people he didn't recognize, missing people. His fingers trembled as he flipped through. The photos became clearer, more recent. Then, they weren't strangers anymore. They were him. His breath caught in his throat. Page after page, picture after picture. Him. Standing in places he had never been. His hands shook as he turned to the final page, a single photo. His own face. Standing on the porch of the cabin. The timestamp read 3:00 a.m. That same night. Ethan's body went cold. His eyes darted toward the window. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in his ears. It was almost 3:00 a.m. Almost time. And outside, beyond the glass, something moved. A shadow. Tall, waiting. And for the first time, it stepped forward. Ethan had stopped believing in escape. The roads had betrayed him. The house had swallowed him whole. The cameras, the evidence, the truth, none of it mattered. He wasn't in control anymore. He never had been. He had one goal left: survive the night. If he could just make it to sunrise, maybe, just maybe, he could break whatever hold this place had on him. So, he barricaded himself inside. The front door locked and bolted. Windows covered. Furniture pushed against every entrance. He didn't care if it looked crazy. He didn't care if he was losing his mind. The knocking had to stop. And if something wanted to get in, it was going to have to tear through wood, metal, and everything he had left inside him. The cabin was silent again. The kind of silence that stretched too long, that made his skin crawl. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, gripping a rusted fireplace poker in both hands. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he refused to close them. Not again. Not ever again. Then, at exactly 3:00 a.m., the knocking returned, but it wasn't coming from the door. It was inside the house. Ethan's breath hitched. He gripped the poker tighter, his knuckles turning white. His heart pounded against his ribs, a violent, erratic rhythm. It was moving. The knocking was moving. From the hallway. To the kitchen. To the walls beside him. His entire body felt like it was locked in ice. He swallowed hard. Then, something shifted. His stomach turned. The light in the room flickered. The shadows on the walls, they moved. Not like normal shadows. Not cast by light, but moving on their own. And his shadow was stretching toward him. Ethan gasped, scrambling to his feet. The dark shape on the floor twisted, crawling toward him. Even though he hadn't moved. It reached for him. His own shadow. A perfect, dark reflection of himself, but not him. His chest heaved. His pulse hammered. This wasn't real. He shut his eyes. His lips trembled as he whispered, "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real." The knocking stopped. The air went still. The silence was so thick, so heavy, it rang in his ears. Slowly, hesitantly, he opened his eyes. His shadow was gone. His body still stood beneath the flickering light. His arms still trembled. His breath still came in ragged gasps. But his reflection in the window was gone. Ethan stumbled backward, shaking his head. No, this wasn't happening. His hands were in his hair now, fingers digging into his scalp as if he could tear the thoughts out, rip the fear away. He turned to the nearest mirror, desperation clawing at his throat. Nothing. The glass reflected the empty room. But not him. He was gone. A choked breath escaped him. He took a step back, his legs weak, his stomach twisting. Then, suddenly his phone buzzed. The sound shattered the silence. His heart nearly stopped. Slowly, with shaking hands, he pulled it from his pocket. The screen was blank. But there was a message, just 2 words. "Look behind you." Ethan's hands went numb. His fingers locked around the phone, holding it so tight the plastic casing creaked. His lungs refused to pull in air. The room was so quiet now. His own heartbeat was the only thing left, slamming against his ribs like a warning. His body screamed at him, "Don't turn around. Don't look. Don't." But his head was already moving. Slowly. So slowly. And then he saw him. Inches away. Tall. Still. Faceless. A void where a face should be. Smooth, empty skin, twisted in some impossible and natural way. Ethan's throat closed. The thing did not move, did not blink. Did not breathe. But Ethan felt it. Felt its presence crawling into his skin, into his mind, pressing into his very existence. His phone slipped from his fingers. His body refused to move, and the faceless man took a step forward. Ethan wanted to scream, but the sound never came out. His throat was tight, his breath locked deep in his chest, trapped beneath the weight of something unnatural. The faceless man stood inches away. Unmoving. Watching. Or maybe listening. Ethan's pulse was hammering so hard it made his head spin. His legs felt like they weren't his own, like he was locked in place, frozen in time. The air was thick, suffocating, warm. It smelled like something old, like dust trapped in the pages of a forgotten book, like the static hum of an old television left on in an empty room. Ethan's body was screaming at him to run, but he couldn't, because the faceless man stepped closer. No sound, no movement. Just suddenly there. His breath came out in ragged, shallow gasps. He tried to move, tried to do anything, but as he lifted his arm, something else moved with it. His shadow. But not the way it should. It twisted, stretched, reached for him, like it wasn't his anymore, like it had taken a life of its own. Ethan's stomach twisted, his body trembled. He shut his eyes. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real. A whisper breathed against his ear. Not words, just sound, like something trying to speak without a mouth. His skin crawled. He forced his eyes open. The faceless man was even closer now. He wasn't standing anymore. He was looming. Towering over Ethan. His faceless head tilted slightly, like he was studying him. Ethan's body jerked. He tried to move, tried to fight, but his limbs weren't his anymore. His head tilted on its own. His fingers twitched without him moving them. His body was being pulled. No, not pulled. Unraveled. Like a thread being tugged from the inside out. The world around him glitched. The cabin flickered. The walls stretched. The sound of the wind became static. He could feel himself slipping. His vision blurred. His reflection in the window wasn't him anymore. The thing staring back had no face. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but the sound came out as static. Weeks later, the cabin sat silent. The sky was clear. The trees swayed lazily in the wind. A new car pulled up the drive. The tires crunched against the gravel, the engine humming softly before it shut off. A young couple stepped out, stretching after the long drive. Their voices were cheerful, excited. "Can't believe we got this place so cheap," one of them laughed. "A whole cabin in the woods, just us. No neighbors, no noise. Just peace and quiet." The other agreed, grinning. They carried their bags inside, the door creaking as it swung open. Dust floated in the sunlight. The air smelled a little stale, like the cabin hadn't been lived in for a while. They didn't mind. The place was perfect. As they set their bags down, one of them noticed something on the table. A small, dusty camera. "Think someone left this behind." The other shrugged. "Press play." The camera whirred. The screen flickered. At first, just static. Then a face. Not a stranger's. Not someone from long ago. Ethan. His face was pale, eyes wide and frantic. The screen glitched, the image warping, as if the video itself was trying to escape. His voice came through the speakers, shaky, desperate. "I don't have much time." The couple stilled. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's voice trembled through the static. "If you hear the knock." A pause. His lips barely moved as he whispered the next words. "Do not open the door." The screen cut to black. The camera clicked off. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the sound came from the window. Slow, rhythmic. The couple exchanged a glance. Then, hesitantly, one of them moved toward the window. The light outside was fading. The glass reflected their own faces, but nothing else. The woods beyond were empty. Nothing was there. Just silence. The knocking had stopped. And yet, the air felt heavier. The shadows stretched a little longer. And somewhere in the darkness outside, something was waiting. Would you survive a night in this cabin? Would you sit there in the dark, hearing the knocking at your door, knowing something was waiting on the other side? If you heard knocking at 3 a.m., would you open the door? Or would you do what Ethan couldn't and resist? Let us know in the comments below. But be careful, because this wasn't the first encounter, and it won't be the last. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling horror stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new nightmare. And tell us in the comments what was your favorite part. What would you have done differently? We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep watching, keep listening, and keep the stories alive.